For nearly 200 years, really everything from the beginning of the 1700s through about the 1880s, chess went through what's known as its Romantic period. In those days, there was really only one opening move used by strong players. 1e4, moving the king pawn 2 squares on your first move as white. Of course, players knew that there were other opening moves and that some of them were even good. However, everyone preferred the king pawn opening because it was bold, aggressive, led to a lot of action, and led to exciting games full of sacrifices and exciting tactics and complexity. Today, there's a lot of other moves we use at the start of the game in chess. People play d4, the queen pawn opening, c4, knight to f3. All of these are considered very viable options. But 1e4 is still one of the most popular moves in the world, and is especially popular for new players and club level players, many of whom only use it exclusively. And it's really for the same reasons that it was popular throughout the 1800s. It leads to exciting, tactical games, and is also just plain a strong move. It's also something that you can learn a lot from because you're going to play more interesting, dynamic, and open positions than you would with some of the other openings. Curling definitely has an equivalent to it, and that's the centerline guard. For many players, the centerline guard is the only opening move in curling, and it's kind of easy to see why. It's a versatile option that leads to more scoring and more rocks in play, and generally it just makes for a more interesting game than throwing into the house on your first rock. So let's break down the centerline guard as an opening move, because it's a really important part of our curling opening book, and we should really understand why we want to throw it, and the times when maybe we don't want to throw it. First of all, obviously, throwing the centerline guard is the best way to set up a steal attempt. The guard guards the button and the important parts of the 4-foot circle, and these are the best places to set up an effective steal. With our guard out in front, we can then draw to that area and be pretty sure it'll be difficult for our opponents to get rid of that rock. Secondly, it's an aggressive play in general. It will normally lead to more rocks in play and higher scoring ends. So, when we're losing, we definitely want to play this rock, as it will give us a better chance to steal and a better chance to potentially steal multiples than putting a rock in the house right away. Now, while you should use this almost always when you're behind, many teams, especially at the club level, also default to using this shot as their standard go-to play in close games. The rock is versatile enough, and this is not yet an extremely aggressive move. So it's a very good way of starting out an end if you're just not sure what the right strategic decision is. The centerline guard is also good in general for teams that feel they draw better than they hit. The centerline guard is also an ideal shot for teams that draw better than they hit. Once you put this rock up, as we said, it is going to create more of a drawing game than throwing a rock in the house to start the end. Your rock, because of the free guard zone, can't be hit, and that's going to entice both teams to throw more rocks behind guards, set up more rocks of their own in front of the house, and do other things, at least for a few rocks, that will keep rocks in play, whether they be guards or rocks in the house. The non-hammer team will definitely come around this rock at some point. That's really why you're throwing it in the first place. And the hammer team will often be goaded or forced into playing in the 4-foot as well, especially if you're able to build a center with your first 2 to 3 rocks. One way or another, the hammer team is going to have to deal with that guard, whether they come around it or they peel it later. Finally, while this might not be a huge concern at club games, it's still worth mentioning that throwing up the center guard is a good way to combat conservative teams playing with the hammer who are looking to blank ends. You may be okay with them blanking once or twice, but at some point, you're going to want to stop and take some initiative in the game, and the center guard is the way to do that. Not that it's at all impossible to blank an end when someone's thrown a center guard, but it's way easier to do so if you're throwing rocks into the house, and the hammer team can start hitting immediately. All of these things lead to another question, however. Where should you be placing your center guards? Well, obviously we want them on the center line, or as close as possible to the center line. I'd really consider anything that's covering the forefoot a center guard, although the closer to the center line, obviously the better. If you're looking to steal with a single guard, you're going to want to put your guard in a position that is high enough that you can fully bury around it. Where exactly that point is will depend a lot on the ice conditions at your club. Remember, you don't want to go too high with this guard. You want it to be just high enough that you can fully bury around it. If you go much higher, as we'll put this rock way up here, a rock that comes around it will probably still be accessible to the other team to hit, even if it's fully buried. On the other hand, if you go too close to the house, you may only be able to partially bury around your rock, and it'll be easier for someone on the other team later in the end to run back your rock and maybe double both of your rocks out of play. On the other hand, if you want a more versatile rock, close to the house is exactly where you want it. This is a big reason why you may have learned early on that getting the guard as tight to the house as possible is considered by many the ideal goal of your first shot. In reality, this isn't always the best play. As I just said, if you really want to steal with your rock, you're probably going to need it to be a little higher. However, that rock really near the house gives you so many options later in the end. You can tap it. You can split it on the rings if you need to get 2 rocks into the house. You can run it back if the opponent manages to bury one behind there later in the end. Or you may even at least be able to get partially buried behind it later in the end yourself and use it as a true guard. Basically, no matter how the rest of the end plays out, you're going to be happy to have that rock on the center line very close to the house. Finally, yes, there is a use even for those centerline guards that just barely get over the hog line. You might think they don't guard things in the house all that well, and you're right. But what they do guard are second rocks that you then place as a guard closer to the house. Now, why would we want to do this? Well, let's say we really, really want to go hard for a steal. In that case, we're probably going to throw 2 guards to start the end. And if we're going to have 2 guards, we'd like to have them as far apart as possible. This way, it's very difficult for our opponents to remove both of those guards with just 1 stone. So in cases where you know you're going to probably throw 2 guards, ideally you'll get one pretty close to the hog line, while the other one is pretty close to the house. I don't want to say the order of those is too critical and probably not worth worrying about much. Probably throwing the higher one first is just a little better, so that if you happen to come into the rings accidentally your second one, it might be buried behind it. If you try to go close to the house on your first rock and you're a little heavy, you're probably just losing that guard entirely, or that rock entirely, since it's not a guard. So when don't we want to throw a center guard? Well, the first and most obvious example is when we already have a big lead. There's 2 reasons for this. One, you don't want to give a guard your opponent can go behind and then potentially set up a bigger end. But secondly, if you throw a rock into the top 4, the other team's not going to hit it if they're way behind anyway. They need to set up guards of their own, and you can pretty safely set up a center by just throwing one in the top 4, maybe throwing a second one in the top 4, and only then thinking about guarding those rocks. Secondly, if you think you're the better team, or particularly if you think you're the better hitting team, it may be good to default to throwing in the house into the top 4 rather than throwing guards. Throwing guards automatically creates some risk because there is the potential for rocks to be curled around them, of course. Meanwhile, if you play in the house and keep the game simple, chances are you're going to make more of those simple shots than the other team, with very little risk of any ends getting out of control. You can wait for the other team to have a miss or 2, then start guarding or setting up your steals that way. Finally, on a similar note, if your team's strength or advantage lies in the hitting game, it's probably best to default to coming in the house unless you fall way behind. There will come a point in games where you absolutely need to steal to stay in the game, and then no matter what your strength is, the center guard's the way to go. But early in the game, or if it's close, you may just want to go in the house and say, hey, we're going to out-hit you. Or if you want to draw, you should be the ones to take the risk while we set up our center nice and simply. So in summary, the center guard is a really versatile shot that works well for teams in most situations. If you're behind and looking to steal, it is absolutely the correct call. If you like to draw as opposed to hit, then you definitely want to be throwing this most of the time. And if you fall behind, you absolutely should throw this no matter what your team's style is. The placement of your center guard will change exactly what you're doing with it, with tighter guards generally being more versatile and higher guards being more about stealing later in the end. Finally, we don't want to throw this rock when we're way ahead or if we really prefer to hit in close games. In those cases, we just want to throw a rock in and tell the other team that, hey, they can take the risks on the corners. We'll just build up a center, and if they want to play conservatively, we'll be happy to hit back and forth with them. So there you go. That's your curling opening book entry on the centerline guard. I do want to point out something really quick in this video. I'm not going to do it every time I do these videos, but it's really important to point out that this strategy board I've been using can be found at howardgriffin.org. Based on what he says on the website, Howard Griffin was a member at the Potomac Curling Club for quite some time and set up a lot of great tools on his website to allow curlers to do things like time games at their club, have a virtual strategy board, and a bunch of other various tools that I will link to so you can check it out and take advantage of the great resources he's provided for us as a curling community. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, hit the subscribe button so you see when new videos come out, and keep watching more of my Chess on Ice content. I'm going to have one more video detailing some of the other shots you might see as first rock for the non-hammer team, and then we're going to jump into the hammer responses to all these first options for the non-hammer team. And that's when things will start to get more complicated and we'll have exponentially more situations to look at. I'm really looking forward to it. I hope you're enjoying this series. And until next time, good curling, everyone.